Morning Journey Church. This is Pastor Chad. Hope you've had a great week. We're going to continue part 3 of our series, What is Normal? So let's dive right into it. Let me start off by asking you a question. How many of you had ever played a high school sport, maybe for a season? For some of you, it was football, basketball, baseball, volleyball, softball, track, whatever it was. Now, some of you remember the games really, really well. There are some games that are just very important to us and that are very memorable. But I also believe that for some of us, if I was to ask you that question, you would say, what I remember is the practices. Way before the season begins, all the drills that you would have to go through, all the laps that you would run. And what we're going to discover today is that you perform the way you perform because of how you trained. This is true physically, and this is true spiritually. So I want to start our discussion about sports in 1 Corinthians 9:24. Paul would say this: do you know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? So Paul is writing to a young bunch of Jesus followers, and he says, listen, you all know that when runners run, they all take off, but only one gets the prize. And so why did this image of racing motivate these people in that culture? Why did he use this idea of racing? Well, let me take you somewhere. This is an image of the Pan-Ethnic Stadium, meaning all Athens Stadium. Some of you what you need to know about this stadium is when the modern Olympics were launched in 1896 in Athens, this is the stadium where the Olympics were launched over 120 years ago. This is the stadium they used. Now, the stadium was not built for those Olympic Games in 1896, but it was remodeled for those Olympic Games. This stadium existed 200 years before the time of Christ. Now, all stadiums may not have been this nice, but there were always stadiums in any city that had any kind of size. Events that would have been held in the stadiums 2,000 years ago would have been running, boxing. They had all sorts of different types of actually boxing, like UFC almost. There was running in armor, throwing a javelin, jumping. They had chariot races. People in the Roman world were fanatical about these games. These games would take place in 4 different cities back then. And the prominent city was that of Olympia. And that's where we would get that word, the word Olympics comes from. The second most popular city where these games were held were just outside the gates of Corinth, where we have been studying. So when Paul would write this letter to the 2 young Christians in the city of Corinth, the most prominent games were held in their backyard. So that's why he uses imagery. So Paul uses sports imagery. He doesn't just use it in one verse, but he uses a whole paragraph. He's going to be talking about training. He's going to be talking about intense training as well. So 2 questions, what we're going to ask today, and we're going to return to them again and again. Number one is, what is your mission? Because often mission directs behavior. Question number 2, what is your level of spiritual fitness? Now, the conversation with Paul, it really doesn't begin outside of town at the stadium, but it really begins inside the town of Corinth at the temple. For the past 2 weeks, I've showed you the map of Corinth. We've also been looking at the Temple of Apollo. Here's an artist rendition of Corinth, and it's in the middle, and in the middle is the Temple of Apollo. The temple still has 7 of its original columns standing, as you can see here. Now, what we know is that there were many, many different temples in Corinth, as I've been talking about for the last few weeks. They had the Temple of Poseidon, which was the god of the sea. And the idea is whatever you wanted, you would go to that temple and offer an animal sacrifice to try to please that god. If you were sick, you would go to the temple of Asclepius, hoping that Asclepius would look down upon you and give you wellness. So no matter what you needed, there was a false god or a temple made up so that you could go offer that particular god a sacrifice. And again, the priest would get all of the meat, but because he got all of the meat and there wasn't refrigeration, the priest couldn't eat all of the meat, so they would sell it to the markets. And so this created a conflict, like we talked about last week, between these two Jesus followers. The first Jesus follower was, okay, what do we do with this idol meat? Can we eat it? And the first perspective was, of course you can. It's just this meat was sacrificed to basically a piece of wood that really is nothing. I mean, you can make a carving, but that doesn't make it a god. And they understood that. But perspective number two was for the new Christians that used to be involved in idol worship that would get so heavy in their hearts thinking about even eating anything that was sacrificed to those idols, because it affected them so deeply, and they felt they were that they had worshipped in such a dark spot. And so this is where both of the groups of people look at each other and say, you're wrong. Only if you were normal like me, you would understand that what you're about to do is wrong. Or the other person would say, what you need to understand is that this meat is perfectly okay to eat. You just need to be normal like me. So Paul, as their spiritual father, they have a question for him. They ask him, who's right? And Paul, in a very masterful way, gets to change the question from who's right, and he changes it to what's helpful. Because it's possible for you to be right, to eat the Apollo burgers, right? But yet make this other person with the perspective of this is so wrong, to stumble in their journey with Jesus. And for Paul, we know what he does if presented with a situation. It depends. It depends on who I'm with. Paul launches into these 4 statements that show you what Paul was attempting to do with his life. And this is what he says in verse 20. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law so as to win those under the law. Verse 21. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. So this is in the context of food. Now, this verse can be very confusing and many times misinterpreted. Paul is not saying when I'm with thieves, I steal. When I'm with drunks, I get plastered. He's not saying when I'm with liars, I lie. When I'm with gossipers, I gossip. I think what Paul is saying is that you could eat the steaks without contaminating yourself spiritually, but that he would change his menu, change what he was eating depending on who he was eating with. Note that part where he says, to the Jew, I became like a Jew. Now, Paul was a Jew. He was raised in a Jewish home. Paul understood kosher. And even today, if you're an Orthodox Jew, there are certain foods you do not eat, such as pork, a cheeseburger. I was in Jerusalem several years ago. In fact, more than several. It was about 25 years ago. And we were eating at an outdoor cafe. And when we walked up to that cafe, to that restaurant, the hostess asked us, would you like to sit in this section or this section? And I'm thinking, there's 2 sections? Is this smoking, non-smoking? No. Because that's something that we used to do a long time ago, right? Smoking or non-smoking. This was not her question, though. Her question, when we walked up, the hostess asked, dairy or meat? The reason for this is there's an Old Testament law that states, do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. So you cannot mix a meat product and a dairy product. So an observant Jew has never had a bacon double cheeseburger. So we're at this restaurant, and it wasn't good enough just to keep the dairy and meat on separate plates, but it had to be divided into 2 sections in that restaurant. Half dairy and half meat was the other part of the restaurant. Listen, Paul was raised in a Jewish background. He knew what the laws were. So when he invited his Jewish friends over, there was no way I'm not offering them idol food. Why? Because if he wants to have a Jesus conversation with them, he doesn't want the conversation to end prematurely because they are offended. So Paul says, I know the Jewish culture. When I'm with them, I'm having a meal and they want to have a conversation, a Jesus conversation. I know how to structure my diet in a way not to alienate them. So the Jews, I became like a Jew in order to, what was the final word that he used that was highlighted there? Win. To win them to having a relationship with Jesus, for them to realize that Jesus came on a rescue mission for them. So I will change my diet to help them win. Okay, Paul, so let's change the background. Now you're being invited by a Greek family who's having a wedding for their daughter in Corinth. They serve you steak and you don't know where the steaks came from. What are you going to do? I'm not going to ask. I'm going to eat and enjoy. Paul says when I'm with those who are without the law, I'm going to feel free to eat with those who are without the law. Why? To win those who are without the law. Okay, Paul, what if you're at a wedding with another Christian that feels it's not right to eat steak? Because in their mind, they are betraying Jesus. What do? He says, I push the steak aside and go for the salad, right? Paul, you're overthinking this. You should be able to do whatever you want whenever you want to do it. You're free to enjoy those lamb chops. Yes, I'm free, and I use that freedom to sometimes eat and sometimes not to eat, depending on the situation and who I have the possibility of influencing. Check out verse 19 here. Through I am what? Free. To eat what I want and belong to no one. I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. See, there are two words here. The first word is free. I'm absolutely free, but I use my freedom to be a slave in order to help what? Win as many people as possible. That's why at the end of verse 22, he says, I have become all things to all people so that by all means I might save some. You're observing a man who's on a mission to win as many people to Christ as he can, and it's changing his dinner here. Why? Because your mission can change your behavior. Therefore, we need to ask the question, what mission are you on? Because there are many different missions. One mission is, I hope through my life I influence people to come to know and follow Christ who gave himself for me. There's also another mission that I was going to call Mission Me. And this mission is where I say, I want to do what I want when I want and do it when I want to. Okay? Depending on what one you choose as a mission, it can affect your relationships. So what mission are you on right now? Think in terms of family right now. There's a possibility of people getting married and while they're still yet maturing. Possibility of people getting married while they're still immature. This happens. This happens a lot. Now, if both the bride and the groom come to a marriage with a mission of, I want what I want when I want it, and nobody better get in my way, this has some pretty predictable fallout. Let's say years pass, and let's say children now enter the program, and you and your wife now sit down and say, we have a desire to see our kids to follow Christ. Men, does this change the way that you would treat your wife? Does that change the way you would respond to your husband, women, in front of your son or your daughter? Listen, what mission you're on changes your behavior. If my only mission is I want what I want when I want it, your behavior will be radically different than the ones who say, I want to be able to rub off onto others and help them in their journey of following Christ. If you're involved in a company where people report to you, you will learn that you can affect other people's behavior and motivate them by demeaning them, intimidating them. And I'm not saying this is the best way of motivating them, but many times this is what people use. If your life's mission is, I want what I want when I want it, it continues with this motivational style of demeaning and intimidation. But if you're in this company 4, 6, 12 years, and you say, I would love for there to be a handful of people that are a few steps closer to knowing Christ because of the way I conducted myself around them, then you would have to choose a different route. We know that Christ is the only way that saves people, but you have the ability to nudge someone towards Christ, or you have the ability to nudge somebody to stumble. See, Paul was on a mission, and the mission he was on was not simply mission Paul. So if Paul was invited to a dinner and he walks into the room and he's casing the place and he looks to see who's there, because even the type of food that he stuck on his fork in that culture could make a difference in someone's spiritual progress. So Paul's mission was, who am I with and what will further the progress with Christ? That was his mission. So can I ask you a question? What mission are you currently on? And does today's conversation tweak that in any way? Paul, Corinth is a multicultural city, and you get people from all different backgrounds. You get Christians who are strong Christians, and you get Christians who are new Christians, Christians with strong conscience, and Christians with a weak conscience. You mature Christians, and you get immature Christians, and just thinking of all the different types of Christians alone, how you behaved must have been exhausting. And Paul says, exactly. Paul says, you want to enter a culture with lucrative different backgrounds, with all sorts of different levels of spiritual maturity, you better get in shape. The conversation immediately moves from mission to the Olympic imagery. It's now that he moves to that verse we started with in verse 24. Do you know that in a race all the runners race, but only one gets the prize? He's not talking here about physical fitness here. He's talking about spiritual fitness. And then he moves on talking about training, verse 25. Everyone who competes in these games go into what? 2 words: strict training. Like the Olympics, they spend their whole lives training to compete in these games. And he goes on and he says for the Olympic Games, they do it to get a crown that will not last. But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. See, when you won an event 2,000 years ago in the Olympic Games, they would give you a wreath for your head. And here's the thing about the pine wreath, the willow wreath, or the olive wreath. They all had a tendency to wilt and die. Paul is saying the crown they get will not last. But the crown that we get as Jesus followers, it has consequences that move into the next world we go into, to heaven. Our crown, it lasts forever. And then he goes on in verse 26. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly, like running kids running around aimlessly in the backyard. What event does he pick next? I do not fight like a boxer beating in the air. I do not box like some guys, just swinging in the air. And again, he returns to personal training. Personally, this is what I do. Verse 27, no, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. What Paul is saying here is when you go into intense physical training, it beats you up. And we use this language. Someone pulls up in the driveway and goes to the fitness class at, let's say, 6 a.m. And if it's rigorous when they leave, they say, man, they really beat me up during that training. Some of you have experienced the training, and this is not fun, but basketball practice. I remember the first time I went to a junior high basketball practice, it seemed like all we did was run and run and run. And it's like, all we did is run in place. We would run to lines. And one of my friends asked the question of the coach, when are we going to get to play basketball? Because all we did is run from the beginning of practice to the finish of practice that day. If you would have asked any of us as we walked off the basketball court during the first few weeks, did you find that enjoyable? Many of us would not have been able to answer because we were so tired. But training is often is not pleasant, and that's a good reminder. quite frankly, many of us avoid spiritual training because it's not that fun. It can be uncomfortable, but that's what we're called to. Now, it also depends on your mission. If your mission is, I want to do what I want to do when I want to do it, virtually no training is involved there. If my mission is, I believe God is in a rescue mission and I want to be a part of that, helping others grow closer in their relationships with Jesus Christ, my friends, we're talking about some rigorous training there. Um, in Michigan, our soccer season was in the fall, and before we let out for the fall into the winter, um, our coach would give us a training regimen, and he would say you need to start off by running 2 miles a day and work your way up to 4 miles, then 6 miles, and then 8 miles to finally 10 miles a day. There were days when I had a job, I had school, and the last thing I wanted to do was get up at 6 in the morning and run, because I didn't feel like running. But I loved that. I loved that because it reminds me that in my spirit, there are times in my life when there are things that I need to be doing that I will not want to do. There will be times in my life that I will need to give an apology when I do not feel like giving an apology. It's spiritual training, my friends. For many of us, it's going to serve other Christians when we simply don't feel like going to serve other people. It's spiritual training. For many of us, it's going to Bible study when we just want to sit home and watch a movie. My friends, it's spiritual training. For many of us, it's coming on a Sunday morning to learn and grow closer to God when it would just be so much easier to sleep in. My friends, it's spiritual training. Many of us, there are days when we read our Bibles when we don't feel like reading our Bibles. My friends, it's spiritual training. I don't feel like doing that today. There's a lot of things we don't feel like doing, but it's spiritual training, and that's what God has called us to. Listen, often we get results we get because of the training we put in. And so my question for you today is, what mission are you on? And how are you physically? And by physically, I mean, how are you spiritually physical? Are you trained? Are you spiritually up to the task of whatever it comes? Have you spiritually been running for 2, 4, 6 miles? Like in soccer, we would run 2, 4, 6, 8 miles. Why? So that when we were in the game, we would not get tired. How are you spiritually? Are you fit? Are you ready to go? And so my question for you today is those two questions. What is your mission, and are you spiritually fit? And so I just want to pray with you today. And as I pray with you, just begin to ask God, what is my mission, and am I spiritually fit? Heavenly Father, we come before you today. We're grateful for these few moments that we were able to spend together. God, I just pray right now that as people are asking you, that you would be pleased to hear their ask. And in their ask, would you give them knowledge of what their mission really is? And let them know these are areas, my son, my daughter, that you need to be more spiritually fit in, that you need to be more spiritually disciplined in, so that when the time comes, we are ready and we know our mission and that we are spiritually fit. And God, we will give you all the praise and all the glory for the outcomes that come. It's nothing that we do, but it's because of everything that you've done in and through us. And so, God, we love you and we thank you for this time in Jesus' name. Amen. Hey, just want to remind you, Thursday evenings we meet at 36 New Street for a great time of home groups. This is just time where we spend time together, talking, praying together, reading through scriptures. We'll read through the scriptures that we read today, and we can just dive in a little bit deeper. So I would encourage you, 36 New Street, Mount Clemens, 7 o'clock Thursday evenings. Hey, church, love you. Hope you're going to have a great week and a blessed week. Can't wait to see you soon. Bye-bye.